Welcome to the Saving History podcast, the sanctuary for castle devotees and medieval history enthusiasts. Prepare to embark on a thrilling voyage through time as we unveil enthralling history and legend. From ancient folklore to cutting-edge restoration, we've got it all covered. So grab your headphones and let's dive right in.
In the cool, misty dawn of a spring morning in 1527, a dark-eyed young woman stood at a window in Greenwich Palace, her gaze fixed on the Thames. Anne Boleyn, not yet 30, was poised on the precipice of history, though she could scarcely have imagined the heights he would reach, or the depths to which he would plummet. Her story, one of the most captivating and tragic in English history, began far from the intrigues of the Tudor court. Born around 1501 at Blickling Hall in Norfolk, Anne was the daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious courtier and diplomat, and Lady Elizabeth Howard. She was of noble lineage. Anne's early years were unremarkable for a girl of her station, but her father's rising fortunes would soon catapult her onto a larger stage. In 1513, at the tender age of 12, Anne was sent to the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands. This cosmopolitan and cultured environment provided the young girl with an education far beyond what most English noblewomen receive. She learned French, developed a taste for fashion and music, and began to cultivate the wit and charm that would later captivate a king. Anne's continental education continued when she was transferred to the French court in 1514, accompanying Henry VIII's sister, Mary Tudor, who was to marry the aging king, Louis XII. When Louis died mere months later, Anne remained in France, serving the new queen, Claude. It was in the sophisticated, licentious French court that Anne truly blossomed. She absorbed the latest in fashion, dance, and courtly love, poetry. More importantly, she was exposed to the new ideas of the Renaissance and the stirrings of religious reform that were beginning to sweep through Europe. Returning to England in 1522, Anne was a changed woman, no conventional English rose. She brought with her a continental flair and a sharp intellect that set her apart from her peers. Her dark eyes, long dark hair, and olive complexion were exotic in a court that prized pale English beauty. Though not classically beautiful, Anne possessed a magnetic charm and vivacity that drew people to her. Initially, Anne's prospects seemed bright but conventional. She embarked on a romance with Henry Percy, heir to the earldom of Northumberland. However, Cardinal Wolsey, Henry VIII's powerful minister, broke up the match, deeming it unsuitable. Little did Wolsey know that in thwarting this romance he was setting the stage for a seismic shift in English history. It was around 1526 that Henry first took notice of Anne. The king, approaching his 40s and growing increasingly desperate for a male heir, had long since tired of his wife, Catherine of Aragon. In Anne he saw not just a potential mistress, but a woman of spirit and intelligence who could potentially give him the son he so desperately craved. Anne, however, was no easy conquest. Unlike her sister Mary, who had briefly been Henry's mistress, Anne refused to become the king's paramour. "I would rather lose my life than my honesty," she reportedly told Henry. This resistance only inflamed the king's passion. What began as infatuation grew into an obsession that would reshape the realm. As Henry's determination to have Anne grew, so did his resolve to end his marriage to Catherine. The king, who had once defended the Catholic Church against Martin Luther, earning the title Defender of the Faith, now turned to those same reformed ideas to bolster his case for annulment. Anne, with her exposure to reformist thought in France, encouraged this new direction. The period from 1527 to 1533 became known as the King's Great Matter. Henry, convinced that his marriage to Catherine was cursed because she had been his brother's widow, sought an annulment from Pope Clement VII. The Pope, under pressure from Catherine's nephew, the powerful Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, prevaricated and delayed. As the years dragged on, Anne's position grew both stronger and more precarious. She was showered with gifts and titles, eventually being created Marquess of Pembroke in her own right, an unprecedented honour for a woman. Yet she was also the target of increasing hostility from those who supported Queen Catherine and the Old Order. The break came in 1532. Henry, frustrated beyond endurance with papal delays, decided to take matters into his own hands. He had already dismissed Cardinal Wolsey, replacing him with Thomas Cromwell, a man committed to royal supremacy. Now, with Cromwell's help, Henry began to lay the groundwork for a break with Rome. In September 1532, Henry and Anne travelled to France, meeting with King Francis I. This trip served a dual purpose: to gain French support for Henry's plans and to give Anne a taste of queenship. It was likely during this trip that Anne finally yielded to Henry's desires, secure in the knowledge that marriage was imminent. Returning to England, events moved swiftly. On January 25th, 1533, Henry and Anne were secretly married. The new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine void and his union with Anne valid. On June 1st, 1533, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Anne's coronation marked the pinnacle of her ascent. The daughter of a mere knight was now Queen of England, anointed and crowned. She was also visibly pregnant, carrying the heir Henry had longed for. The future seemed bright, full of promise for the new royal couple and their reformist allies. Yet even at this moment of triumph, the seeds of disaster were being sown. The break with Rome, formalized by the Act of Supremacy in 1534, had created powerful enemies both at home and abroad. Many English people, especially in the conservative north, resented the abandonment of Catherine and the traditional faith, and when Anne gave birth in September 1533, the child was a girl, the future Elizabeth I. As the golden summer of 1533 faded into autumn, Anne Boleyn stood at the height of her power. She had achieved what many thought impossible, rising from the daughter of a knight to the crowned and anointed Queen of England. She had sparked a reformation and reshaped the relationship between church and state in England, but the ground beneath her feet was not as solid as it seemed. The dramatic rise of Anne Boleyn was about to be matched by an equally dramatic fall. The year 1536 dawned, cold and foreboding over the Tudor court. Anne Boleyn, once the radiant centre of Henry's world, found herself on increasingly treacherous ground. The golden promises of 1533 had tarnished quickly. Where once there had been love and ambition, now lurked disappointment, political tension, and deadly conspiracy. Anne's position had been precarious from the start. Her marriage to Henry had scandalized Christendom, leading to England's break with Rome and isolation from Catholic Europe. Many of Henry's subjects, particularly in the conservative north, viewed her as a usurper and heretic. Even among the reformist faction at court, Anne's sharp tongue and wilfulness had made her enemies. But it was in the bedchamber, ironically the scene of her greatest triumph, that Anne's real failure lay. The daughter she had borne in September 1533, the future Elizabeth I, was healthy and precocious, but she was not the male heir Henry craved. A pregnancy in 1534 had ended in miscarriage. As 1536 began, Anne was again with child. The stakes could not have been higher. The first blow fell on January 24. Henry was participating in a jousting tournament at Greenwich Palace when he was thrown from his horse, which then fell on top of him. For 2 hours the king lay unconscious, his life hanging in the balance. The incident shook the court to its core. What would happen if Henry died? Would Anne, pregnant and unpopular, be able to secure the throne for her daughter? Or would Henry's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, be crowned? The king recovered, but the accident had profound consequences. It seems to have strengthened Henry's determination to secure the succession with a male heir. It also appears to have exacerbated certain paranoid tendencies in the king's character. Henry began to muse darkly about having been bewitched into his marriage with Anne. Then, on January 29, disaster struck. On the day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral, Anne miscarried a male fetus, about 15 weeks old. The timing could not have been worse. Many at court saw it as divine retribution for Henry's treatment of Catherine. For Henry, it was the final straw. In his anger and disappointment, he ominously declared that he would have no more boys by her. As winter turned to spring, the atmosphere at court grew increasingly toxic. Anne's enemies, chief among them the conservative Catholic faction led by the Duke of Norfolk, ironically Anne's own uncle, sensed an opportunity. They found an unexpected ally in Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister and architect of the Reformation. Cromwell, once Anne's ally, had come to see her as a liability. Her outspoken support for further religious reforms and her interference in foreign policy. She opposed Cromwell's plans for an alliance with the Holy Roman Empire, had put them at odds. Moreover, Cromwell understood that his own position depended entirely on the king's favour. If Henry wanted to be rid of Anne, Cromwell would oblige. Meanwhile, a new star had risen at court. Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, had caught the king's eye. Demure, conventional, and from an old Catholic family, Jane was in many ways Anne's opposite. She represented a return to tradition that appealed to Henry in his growing conservatism and desire for stability. As April turned to May, events began to move with terrifying speed. On April 30th, Mark Smeaton, a court musician known to be friendly with Anne, was arrested and interrogated. Under torture, he confessed to being Anne's lover. Over the next few days, other men of the court were arrested. Henry Norris, the king's groom of the stool, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, and, most shockingly, George Boleyn, Anne's own brother. The charges were monstrous: adultery, incest, and treason. Anne was accused of having slept with all these men, of plotting the king's death, and of incest with her brother. The dates of the alleged offences were vague, many demonstrably false. But truth was not the objective. Anne's destruction was. On May 2nd, Anne herself was arrested. She had been watching a game of real tennis when she was summoned to appear before the Privy Council. There, she was informed of the charges against her and ordered to be taken to the Tower of London. Her protests of innocence fell on deaf ears. As Anne was rowed down the Thames to the Tower, the full horror of her situation must have become clear. The woman who had risen from relative obscurity to become Queen of England was now branded a traitor and adulteress. The king, who had moved heaven and earth to marry her now, sought her destruction. The speed and comprehensiveness of Anne's fall testified to the efficiency of Tudor statecraft and the precariousness of power in Henry's court. Within a matter of days, a queen had been transformed into a prisoner, her supporters arrested or silenced, her future obliterated. Yet, questions remain. Was Anne truly guilty of the charges against her? Most historians today believe not. The evidence was flimsy, the confessions extracted under torture. The dates of many of the alleged offences were demonstrably impossible, with Anne away from court, or even pregnant at the time. More likely, Anne was the victim of a perfect storm of political, personal, and dynastic factors. Henry's desperation for a male heir, Cromwell's political manoeuvring, the animosity of the Catholic faction at court, and Anne's own abrasive personality all contributed to her downfall. As May progressed, the legal machinery of Tudor justice ground into action. A secret commission of oyers and terminer was set up to gather evidence. Indictments were prepared. The stage was set for a series of trials that would shock Tudor England and reverberate through history. Anne Boleyn, the woman who had revolutionized England, who had been the catalyst for the break with Rome and the English Reformation, now found herself alone and abandoned. As she entered the Tower on that May evening, she was stepping into the last act of her life's drama. The woman who had once been the rising sun of the Tudor court was now facing a swift and terrible sunset. On the evening of May 2nd, 1536, a small barge slipped quietly along the Thames, its destination the most feared address in England, the Tower of London. In it sat Anne Boleyn, still adorned in the fine clothes she had been wearing that day. Now, those same garments seemed a mockery of her fallen state. The woman who had entered the Tower in triumph 3 years earlier as a queen to be, was returning as an accused traitor. As the barge approached the Tower, Anne would have seen the infamous Traitor's Gate looming before her. This water gate, through which so many prisoners had passed to their doom, now waited to receive a queen. The symbolism would not have been lost on Anne, a woman keenly aware of history and her place in it. As she stepped from the barge onto the stairs, legend has it that she paused and said, "Here landeth as true a subject, being prisoner, as ever landed at these stairs." The lieutenant of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, was waiting to receive her. Kingston, a veteran courtier, had been appointed to this position by Henry himself and was known for his loyalty to the crown. His demeanour towards Anne was correct but cold. He was to be both her jailer and her spy, tasked with reporting her every word and action back to Thomas Cromwell. Anne was led to the royal apartments within the Tower. This might seem like a courtesy to her royal status, but it was a calculated move. These were the same rooms where she had stayed before her coronation, a cruel reminder of how far she had fallen. Moreover, the apartments were spacious enough to allow for constant observation by her ladies-in-waiting, who would report everything to Kingston. As the heavy doors closed behind her, the full weight of her situation must have descended on Anne. The Queen of England was now a prisoner, cut off from her supporters, her daughter, and any news of the outside world. The woman who had once been at the centre of all court gossip and intrigue was now the subject of it, unable to defend herself or even know the full extent of the charges against her. In those first hours of imprisonment, Anne's behaviour swung wildly between extremes. At times she was almost hysterical, laughing inappropriately and making strange remarks. "I shall have justice," she declared at one point, only to dissolve into tears moments later. She asked repeatedly about the fate of her brother and the other men arrested with her, but received no answers. Kingston, in his reports to Cromwell, noted Anne's much lamentation and heaviness. He also recorded her protestation that she could be proved innocent if only she could speak to the king. Anne clung to the belief that Henry, once confronted with her in person, would realize the falsity of the charges against her. It was a vain hope. Henry had already distanced himself emotionally from his second queen. As the days passed, a routine of sorts developed. Anne was allowed to hear Mass daily, a concession to her rank, but also a chance for her guards to observe her closely. She spent much of her time in prayer, perhaps finding solace in the reformed faith she had done so much to promote in England. Her ladies-in-waiting, appointed by the Crown, were constantly with her, ostensibly to serve her but, in reality, to spy on her. One of the cruelest aspects of Anne's imprisonment was her separation from her daughter, Elizabeth. The almost 3-year-old princess had been declared illegitimate and removed from the succession. Anne repeatedly asked after Elizabeth, but was given no information. The thought of her daughter's uncertain future must have weighed heavily on the imprisoned queen. Despite her dire circumstances, Anne's sharp mind remained active. She engaged in theological discussions with her chaplain, showing the depth of her reformed beliefs. She also composed poetry, including the famous verse, "O Death, rock me asleep," which tradition attributes to her time in the Tower. Whether or not Anne actually wrote this poem, it captures the despair and resignation that must have tempered her initial defiance. "O death, rock me asleep, bring me to quiet rest. Let pass my weary, guiltless ghost out of my careful breast." As news of events outside the Tower trickled in, Anne's hopes for acquittal began to fade. She learned of the arrests and confessions of the men accused with her, though she steadfastly denied any wrongdoing. The speed with which events were moving must have been terrifying. In Tudor England, arrest for treason was often tantamount to a death sentence. Perhaps the most poignant moment of Anne's early imprisonment came when she asked Kingston about the method of her execution. "I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck," she remarked, managing a touch of gallows humour even in her despair. This comment, with its mixture of courage and resignation, encapsulates the complexity of Anne's character and her response to her fall. As May wore on, preparations for Anne's trial began. She was allowed to meet with her appointed legal counsel, though in the biased Tudor legal system this was more a formality than a real chance at defence. Anne, once the most powerful woman in England, was now powerless to shape her own fate. The Tower, which had seen so much of English history unfold within its walls, was now witness to one of its most dramatic chapters. A queen who had changed the course of English history, who had been instrumental in breaking England's ties with Rome and ushering in the Reformation, was now its prisoner. The stone walls that had once echoed with the sounds of her coronation festivities now contained her prayers, her fears, and perhaps her regrets. As Anne prepared to face her accusers, the stage was set for one of the most sensational trials in English history. The woman who had defied convention and risen to the highest position in the land would now have to summon all her courage and wit for the fight of her life. The drama that had begun with the king's infatuation was rushing towards its tragic conclusion. On the morning of May 15th, 1536, the great hall of the Tower of London buzzed with tense anticipation. Nobles, judges, and spectators gathered for an event unprecedented in English history, the trial of a Queen of England for high treason. Anne Boleyn, who had ascended to the throne amid controversy and defiance of tradition, would now face judgment in a spectacle designed not for justice but for her destruction. The legal proceedings against Anne had begun days earlier, on May 10th, with the indictments issued by the grand juries of Middlesex and Kent. These indictments painted a shocking picture of a queen mired in adultery, incest, and treason. Anne stood accused of sexual relationships with 5 men: Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, Mark Smeaton, and her own brother George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. Moreover, she was charged with conspiring the death of the king, a charge that transformed alleged adultery into high treason. The composition of the court itself spoke volumes about the nature of these proceedings. Presiding over the trial was Anne's own uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. The jury consisted of 26 peers of the realm, many of whom had personal or political reasons to desire Anne's downfall. Among them were Henry's illegitimate son, the Duke of Richmond, and Anne's former betrothed, the Earl of Northumberland. The deck was stacked against the Queen from the start. As Anne was led into the great hall, a hush fell over the assembled crowd. She had been allowed to dress in fine clothes befitting her rank, a gown of black velvet with a crimson damask kirtle, topped with her trademark French hood. Her demeanour, observers noted, was calm and dignified, a far cry from the hysteria that had marked her early days in the Tower. The charges were read out in excruciating detail. The indictments alleged specific instances of adultery, providing dates and locations for each offence. Yet these very details would prove to be the weakness in the prosecution's case. Many of the dates given were demonstrably false, with Anne proven to be elsewhere at the time of the alleged encounters. In one instance, she was said to have committed adultery at Greenwich, when records clearly showed her to be at Richmond. Anne pleaded not guilty to all charges. When given the opportunity to speak, she defended herself with eloquence and conviction. "I am not guilty of these charges," she declared. "I have always been a faithful wife to the king. I confess I have had jealous fancies and suspicions of him, which I had not discretion enough and wisdom to conceal at all times. But God knows, and is my witness, that I have not sinned against him in any other way." Her words, though powerful, fell on deaf ears. The outcome of this trial had been predetermined. The speed with which the proceedings moved testifies to this fact. In a single day, the court heard the charges, the limited evidence presented, and Anne's defence. There were no witnesses called, no cross-examinations. The entire process was a formality, a thin veneer of legality over what was essentially a political execution. One of the most poignant moments of the trial came when the verdict was announced, as the Duke of Norfolk pronounced Anne guilty and sentenced her to death, either by burning or beheading as the king's pleasure shall be further known. Anne remained composed. She raised her eyes to heaven and said, O Father, O Creator, thou who art the way, the truth, and the life, thou knowest that I have not deserved this death. The trial of the men accused with Anne had taken place a few days earlier. On May 12th, Mark Smeaton, the only commoner among the accused, had pleaded guilty, likely as a result of torture. The other four, including Anne's brother George, had pleaded not guilty but were nevertheless convicted. Their sentences had already been carried out by the time of Anne's trial, a fact that must have weighed heavily on the Queen's mind as she faced her own judgment. The legal proceedings against Anne Boleyn reveal much about the nature of justice in Tudor England. The trial was less about determining guilt or innocence than it was about providing a public justification for actions already decided upon. The charges themselves were crafted to ensure the maximum possible offence. By accusing Anne of plotting the king's death, her alleged adultery became high treason, a crime punishable by death. Moreover, the trial served a political purpose beyond the immediate goal of removing Anne. It allowed Henry to paint himself as a victim of his wife's alleged depravity, preserving his image as a wronged husband rather than a capricious tyrant. The public nature of the proceedings, unusual for cases of high treason, suggests that Henry and his advisers were keenly aware of the need to manage public opinion. As Anne was led away from the great hall, her fate sealed, the implications of her conviction reverberated through England. The Queen's fall from grace was complete, her enemies triumphant. Yet in her dignified defence and her steadfast proclamation of innocence, Anne had perhaps won a different kind of victory. She had faced her accusers with courage and eloquence, leaving a lasting impression on even those predisposed to believe in her guilt. The verdict against Anne set in motion a series of events that would reshape the Tudor dynasty. On May 17th, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer declared Anne's marriage to Henry null and void, retroactively stripping her of her title as Queen and bastardizing her daughter, Elizabeth. The path was now clear for Henry to marry Jane Seymour, which he would do a mere 10 days after Anne's execution. As the Tower fell quiet in the wake of the trial, Anne Boleyn prepared herself for her final days. The woman who had changed the course of English history now faced her own place in that history. Her trial, though a travesty of justice, had showcased the strength of character that had carried her to the throne. Now that same strength would see her through to the end. In the pre-dawn hours of May 19th, 1536, a solitary candle flickered in the Queen's apartments of the Tower of London. Anne Boleyn, once the most powerful woman in England, now sat alone awaiting the sunrise that would be her last. The past days had been a whirlwind of fear, resignation, and final preparations. Now, in these quiet hours, Anne faced the ultimate test of the faith and courage that had defined her remarkable life. Following her conviction on May 15th, Anne had expected a swift execution. However, her final days were marked by a series of delays and uncertainties that must have been agonizing. Originally scheduled for May 18th, her execution was postponed by a day, ostensibly due to the late arrival of the executioner from Calais. This delay, while brief, allowed Anne more time for spiritual preparation, and perhaps for Henry to have second thoughts. If Anne harboured any such hope, it was in vain. During these final days, Anne's behaviour was a study in contrasts. At times, she displayed a dark humour, joking with her ladies about the slenderness of her neck and the skill of the French swordsman summoned to perform the execution. This gallows humour belied the terror she must have felt, a final display of the wit and courage that had once captivated a king. At other times, Anne was overcome with emotion. She vacillated between proclaiming her innocence and expressing remorse for any offence she might have given the king. To Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, she swore on the damnation of her soul that she had never been unfaithful to Henry. Yet she also asked Kingston to seek the king's forgiveness on her behalf for any wrongs she might have done him. Anne's spiritual preparation was a central focus of her final days. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, once her ally in the Reformation of the English Church, visited her to hear her last confession. In a letter to Thomas Cromwell, Cranmer reported that Anne had sworn her innocence before God, a declaration that clearly troubled the Archbishop. Despite the political necessity of supporting the king's actions, Cranmer seemed to believe in Anne's innocence, a belief that would inform his efforts to protect her daughter Elizabeth in the years to come. On the eve of her execution, Anne requested the presence of the Eucharist in her chambers, spending much of the night in prayer. Her faith, which had played such a crucial role in England's break with Rome, now provided her solace in her final hours. She also wrote a poignant letter to her daughter Elizabeth, entrusting it to her chaplain to be delivered when the princess came of age. The contents of this letter are unknown, lost to history, but one can imagine the mix of love, regret, and hope that Anne might have expressed to the child she would never see again. As the night wore on, Anne turned her attention to more worldly matters. She distributed her few remaining possessions among her ladies-in-waiting, each gift accompanied by a request for prayers for her soul. To Mary Wyatt, sister of the poet Thomas Wyatt, she gave a small prayer book. Inside, Anne had written a poignant couplet. "Remember me when you do pray, that hope doth lead from day to day. These personal effects, cherished by their recipients, will become precious relics of the fallen queen." In the early hours of the morning, Anne began to prepare herself physically for her final public appearance. She chose to wear a gown of dark grey damask, trimmed with fur, a colour that symbolized both mourning and dignity. Over this she would wear a mantle of ermine, a royal fur that asserted her queenly status even in death. Her choice of attire was both a practical consideration. The fur would soak up the blood, sparing spectators a gruesome sight, and a final statement of her royal identity. As dawn broke, Anne broke her fast, taking the Eucharist one last time. She then gathered her ladies around her for a final address. In a steady voice she asked them to forgive her if she had not always treated them as well as she might have. She urged them to remain true to the Reformed faith, a last assertion of the religious convictions that had shaped her life and reign. Finally, she reminded them of their duty to the new queen, Jane Seymour, a gesture of remarkable grace given the circumstances. The Tower began to stir with activity as officials and spectators prepared for the execution. Anne, however, remained calm, her composure a stark contrast to the nervous energy around her. When Sir William Kingston came to escort her to the scaffold, she was ready, her demeanour serene and dignified. As she stepped out of her chambers for the last time, Anne Boleyn was no longer the frightened prisoner or the disgraced queen. She had transformed herself into a figure of tragic dignity, prepared to face her fate with courage and grace. Her final walk would take her across the Tower Green to the scaffold that awaited her. With each step she moved, not just towards her death, but towards her place in history. The woman who had changed the course of English history, who had inspired a king to break with Rome, who had given birth to one of England's greatest monarchs, was about to face her final moment on the world stage. As she emerged into the light of that May morning, Anne Boleyn prepared to meet her fate with the same fierce determination and indomitable spirit that had marked her extraordinary life. As the sun rose over the Tower of London on May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn faced her final moments with remarkable composure. Her execution was swift and, by the standards of the time, merciful. With a single stroke of the French swordsman's blade, the life of one of England's most controversial and influential queens came to an end. Yet, in many ways, Anne Boleyn's story was just beginning. In the immediate aftermath of her death, efforts were made to erase Anne from history. Her portraits were destroyed, her emblems removed from palace walls, and her name was rarely mentioned at court. Henry moved on quickly, marrying Jane Seymour a mere 10 days after Anne's execution. It seemed for a moment that Anne Boleyn might fade into obscurity, remembered only as a cautionary tale of ambition overreaching itself. However, history had other plans. The consequences of Anne's brief reign would continue to shape England for generations to come. Perhaps her most significant legacy was her daughter Elizabeth. Despite being declared illegitimate after her mother's fall, Elizabeth would go on to become one of England's greatest monarchs. The qualities that defined Elizabeth's reign, her intelligence, her force of will, her political acumen, were often attributed to her mother's influence, even if that influence was more genetic than direct. Anne's role in the English Reformation, too, would have far-reaching consequences. Although Henry had initiated the break with Rome for personal reasons, Anne had been a driving force behind the religious reforms that followed. Her promotion of reformist ideas and her patronage of evangelical scholars helped to lay the groundwork for the Protestant England that would emerge under Elizabeth. The Book of Common Prayer, first introduced during Edward VI's reign, owed much to the reformist movement that Anne had championed. In the centuries that followed, Anne Boleyn's story continued to captivate the public imagination. She became a figure of fascination for historians, novelists, playwrights, and filmmakers. Each generation seemed to reinvent Anne, projecting onto her the values and concerns of their own time. In the 19th century, she was often portrayed as an innocent victim of Henry's tyranny. Later interpretations would emphasize her role as a proto-feminist figure, a woman who dared to challenge the patriarchal norms of her time. Anne's physical presence, too, seemed to linger. The Tower of London, where she spent her final days, became inextricably linked with her story. Reports of Anne's ghost haunting the tower began to circulate as early as the 17th century. Visitors and guards alike have reported seeing a headless figure in Tudor dress gliding along the corridors or across the Tower Green. Whether one believes in such apparitions or not, these ghost stories speak to Anne's enduring hold on the popular imagination. The site of Anne's burial also became a point of contention and fascination. Hastily interred in an unmarked grave within the tower's chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, her exact resting place was lost to time. In the 19th century, during renovations of the chapel, workers discovered a female skeleton that was believed to be Anne's. These remains were reinterred with greater dignity, and a marker was placed to commemorate her. This act of belated recognition speaks to the way in which Anne's reputation had been rehabilitated over the centuries. Anne's influence can be seen in unexpected places. The nursery rhyme Sing a Song of Sixpence is often interpreted as an allegorical reference to Anne's fall, with the blackbirds baked in a pie representing her accused lovers. While the historical accuracy of this interpretation is debatable, its persistence demonstrates how deeply Anne's story has permeated our cultural consciousness. In the realm of popular culture, Anne has been portrayed by some of the most talented actresses of each generation, from Merle Oberon to Natalie Portman to Claire Foy. Each portrayal has added new layers to our understanding of this complex historical figure. The musical Six, which reimagines the wives of Henry VIII as a pop group, has introduced Anne's story to a new generation, emphasizing her wit, charisma, and tragic fate. Historically, Anne's legacy has been the subject of ongoing debate and reassessment. The charges that led to her execution are now widely regarded as false, a product of political machination rather than any real wrongdoing on Anne's part. This understanding has led to efforts to formally recognize her innocence. In 2005, a legal scholar submitted a petition for Anne's posthumous pardon, arguing that her conviction was unlawful even by the standards of Tudor jurisprudence. While no official pardon has been granted, the very fact that such efforts are made nearly 500 years after her death speaks to the enduring fascination with her story. Anne's impact on the institution of the English monarchy has been profound and lasting. Her rise and fall demonstrated the precariousness of royal favour and the dangers of tying the succession too closely to the whims of the monarch. The turbulent years that followed her death, the rapid succession of Henry's later wives, the fraught reigns of Edward VI and Mary I, can be seen as direct consequences of the dynastic instability that began with Anne's execution. In a broader sense, Anne Boleyn's story continues to resonate because it touches on themes that remain relevant today. The abuse of power, the role of women in society, the intersection of personal ambition and public duty. Her life and death serve as a mirror in which we can examine our own society's values and power structures. As we stand at the remove of nearly 5 centuries, Anne Boleyn remains an enigmatic and compelling figure. Was she a scheming temptress or a tragic victim, or something far more complex than any of these labels suggest? Perhaps it is this very complexity, this resistance to easy categorization, that ensures Anne's continuing fascination for each new generation of historian. In the end, Anne Boleyn's legacy is not just about what she did or what was done to her. It's about the questions her story continues to provoke about power, gender, religion, and the nature of historical truth itself. As long as these questions remain relevant, Anne Boleyn will continue to haunt us, not as a headless spectre in the tower, but as a complex, challenging presence in our historical consciousness, forever inviting us to look again, to question, and to wonder. And thus concludes another chapter in our ongoing exploration of medieval history. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. If you've enjoyed today's episode and want to delve deeper into the fascinating world of the Middle Ages, I invite you to join our community on Patreon. Find the link in our description or search for the Saving History channel on Patreon. Our subscribers get access to exclusive bonus episodes, early releases, and a wealth of additional medieval content. Don't forget to subscribe to Saving History on your favorite podcast platform to ensure you never miss an episode. Remember, in understanding our past, we gain insight into our present. Until our next historical adventure, this is your host, Hunter, encouraging you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep saving history.